Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, I have quite a story for you all today about an Iraq combat veteran who went on to become the founder and CEO of a company called ID.me. And he's now leading a talented team focusing on increasing trust in digital transactions. But today, I invited him on the podcast to hear more about his story, how he came up with the idea for ID.me, and also the influences of his military service and what that had on the company too. Not to mention the impact of digital IDs and the impact that they'll have on the future of the internet. So we got a lot to talk about. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Washington, D.C. so we can speak with Blake Hall about all this and much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about how you got here and share your origin stories with everyone listening?
Sure. So my name is Blake Hall, and I'm the founder and CEO of ID.me. In what feels like a different life, I was a third generation soldier. So I served over in Iraq in 2006, 2007, when things were pretty intense. I led a reconnaissance platoon of scouts and snipers. And right before we went into country, we were briefed that you're not going to be doing any reconnaissance or precision engagement. And we, in fact, were targeting some of the worst al-Qaeda vehicle bomb networks and some of the senior insurgent leadership that were causing a lot of suffering over there in that country. And in many ways, that was my introduction to entrepreneurship, a situation that you have not really trained before other than in core principles, reacting to new information, new technologies, figuring out how to, operate effectively as a team. And when we started, we weren't very good at what we were doing. Our success rate was about half of the success rate on average in the Iraqi theater. But when we left, our success rate was over 90%. And by several metrics, we were the best performing team in terms of taking down these vehicle bomb networks. And so that was a transformative event in my life. I ultimately didn't feel there was a lot of strategy behind what we were doing in the Middle East. And so I wanted to make an impact in a way that I felt would be lasting and would positively impact people's lives. And so decided I wanted to go to business school and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And my battalion commander had some colorful words for me, but then he said, listen, I'm not going to write you a letter of recommendation unless you apply to Harvard Business School. And I was like, Sir Harvard, I haven't used a 3-syllable word, in the last month. Like, have you been around me and my guys? It's more grunting than it is articulate spoken word. But he had a tremendous impact on the arc of my life. And I ended up at Harvard Business School. And that's ultimately where ID.me started as an academic project during my second year in 2009 to 2010.
Wow, what an incredible story. And I've got to ask, how did you find that transition? Because I know it's a transition that many vets find incredibly difficult. What did you go through there? What did you find it more challenging than you was expecting?
I think what a lot of veterans struggle with is a sense of higher purpose and meaning in that, this was my first real job, as a young adult. And for all the bigger stuff that was wrong with our, adventures in the Middle East, our problem set was pretty discrete. You have a vehicle bomb network that's killing 1,000 people a month and go stop them, and that's something that's not hard to get motivated around. And when you lose that, a search for meaning becomes really kind of existential because it's become part of your identity. I think at the same time, what I'm very grateful for my experience in combat is that it fundamentally reset my view of risk. I think a lot of folks, especially when they've been very successful and they get into these elite universities, they've never failed before. And they're want to keep that going. They don't really want to experience failure because failure is hard. And I had experienced failure, and I knew how precious and fragile life was, given my experience. And I resolved, I don't know if today is going to be my last, but I want to do something that matters and makes the world better for other people, because I know that tomorrow is not guaranteed. And in that way, my experience in combat really had a transformative impact, and that the most risky thing that you can do is not go for it and to be sucked into these big bureaucracies. And so for that, it was really helpful. But I was just trying to, take a year or two to just, figure out first how to adjust from like Baghdad to Cambridge, which was pretty schizophrenic in its own right, and then figure out, what I wanted to do with the rest of my life.
And it was a long time ago, but I spent a long time on a children's cancer ward. And I remember finding it very difficult going back out into the real world and people that had not seen the kind of things that I'd seen. And it makes you look at life very differently. Did you have a similar outlook when you find yourself at Harvard? And obviously you've seen a lot of bad things and the kind of thing, but you're surrounded in an environment where people have not seen that. I know it's completely different, but was that a struggle too?
Absolutely. I think it's why I joined the rugby team, to be honest.
Yeah.
I needed, something just real and authentic, and that sense of camaraderie that I'd had, because there is a sense of loneliness when you come out, for sure, that you've been through something that's incredibly difficult to explain to people, and even if you could explain it, they just wouldn't understand it. James Joyce, the famous author, called them secret messengers who've seen great and profound things, but when they try to like connect to the rest of society, it's just really difficult because they themselves have been changed. And for sure, I felt that, and what I resolved to do with it is to channel that sense of like grief and what I'd learned into something that was bigger than myself, that would be a good thing, especially after having seen a lot of suffering. And I think that's all that you can do, is like, you can only take those traumatic experiences and try to turn them into something for good.
100% with you on that. And one of the reasons I invited you on the podcast today was fast forward to present day and talk about ID Me. So can you set the scene and tell the listeners a little bit more about what ID Me is, and also the kind of problems that you set out to solve with it?
Sure. So, when I was at Harvard, it wasn't lost on me that Mark Zuckerberg had started a pretty successful company, and initially it was just for kids at Harvard, and then it was for, Ivy League students, and then it was for all students. And then Facebook grew up with its user base. And for me, I was very passionate about supporting the military community. And one of the problems that I perceived was, Craigslist was missing at a lot of military communities, and Craigslist fundamentally has trust issues around identity, sex trafficking, people trying to sell jewelry and getting robbed or worse. And I thought, like maybe it's, if you could start with like the military and then maybe students and create a bit of a gated garden, that could be a Craigslist 2.0 with trust and identity, wrapped around it. What I found was that we were spending most of our time on the identity and the verification part of what we do. And we had feedback from the market. One was the companies that we needed to get critical mass to reach members of the military community, they would take like 2 to 3 years of business development before they might move. And I just wasn't willing, to do that or to wait that long to run an experiment as an entrepreneur. But what we learned at the same time is we watched behavior, and like every Veterans Day, veterans were showing their separation paperwork, which had their social security number on it, to get like a free appetizer at the Outback. And I remember thinking like, no, you should not show your social to a stranger to get a free fried vegetable. That's not a good trade. And as we talked to some of these retail organizations, they said, we'd love to deliver more of these like military programs online, but we don't have a way to verify that somebody's a part of this community online. And as a result, we have to deliver like e-learning vouchers through government offices and things like that. And they said, by the way, it's not just for military, it's for students, it's for teachers, it's for first responders, maybe for social influencers. It's way bigger, this problem of digital identity, than just the community that you're talking to us about right now. And at the same time, President Obama had started this initiative called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, a very big like mouthful. NSTIC was the government acronym. And the premise was, why are we making individuals who need to access the government create a new login and verify their identity with a credit bureau over and over again. And, if you're on like food stamps, then you might be on Medicaid, and then you might be on unemployment, and you end up having to create 3 logins, and the government pays the same vendor 3 times. The premise was like, why don't we just verify them once and then move the verified data with the login and create single sign-on? That really like sparked a passion in me, where I said, well, what I'm focused on for the military, in order to empower people to control their own data across these organizations without overexposing like their social security number, veterans also need to log into the VA, which is one of our biggest government agencies here in the States. And holy cow, like if you have seniors and students who also need to get verified over here in the private sector in a similar way, and then they go to federal student aid and the Department of Education, you can really create a network that works like Visa, where people control their own data across websites. And once they've verified, it's like a digital driver's license. They get, with giving permission and authorization, they can very quickly prove their identity to a second and third website rather than registering from scratch at every single new one. It's like the password problem on steroids. And I saw that, I also began to question, like, why are credit bureaus the vendors that government agencies use to verify identity? There's tens of millions of Americans who don't have credit history, where something that's annoying for folks who are blessed like myself to have credit, where you have to go through this redundant process. There were 45 million Americans who don't have credit and didn't have the ability to prove their identity online, and that felt very unfair to me. And that's what we resolved to make better by empowering people with control of their own data.
And if you're to write both of these down, your military service and ID.me, most people listening will think that they're completely different entities and got very little in common. But it sounds like it still had a huge influence on what you were doing. Is that right?
Absolutely, it did. One of the most basic thing is that normal people have a pattern of life that's completely the opposite of a terrorist, right? So when I was tracking down guys that were, senior leaders in Al-Qaeda or some of the Iranian, Quds groups, swapping SIM cards, changing phone numbers, voice biometric couriers, different bed down locations, tapping into a normal pattern of life in a way that's more accessible for people versus questions and answers, from credit bureaus that have been, or data brokers that have been breached multiple times. I was like, well, this solution or this method has been compromised by bad guys because of all the data breaches. And it's really hard for people to remember the own answers to their questions and identity. Whereas mobile phone ownership is much more ubiquitous. Clicking a link that's texted to you is much easier to do for more demographics. And, with that as a foundation, it turns out I'd been given a terrific education on identity within the military. And the military had also taught me to adapt to problems that I'd never seen before, to be comfortable with ambiguity and to lead a team through that, and to kind of pin it down and isolate it and just get a little bit better every day. And I think that's a lot of what innovation on the internet is like, once you identify the big problem that you need to solve, just start eating that elephant one bite at a time. And if you've got a really good team that learns every day, you can create something really meaningful over time.
And for everyone listening, what would you say the real value of digital ID is here in 2022? And also what makes ID.me that little bit different and unique in the sector?
Sure. So, the value of an ID card is a function of how many places it's accepted and what it's used for. So, take Visa's tagline, it's everywhere that you want to be. If you need to make a payment, Visa's value as a network is that they're at more merchants than anybody else, where that card in your wallet can help you. And if you go to a merchant that doesn't use Visa, you quickly find out how important that ubiquity and portability is. Physical credentials are inherently portable, like they go in your wallet, and wherever you go, they go, with you. But they also need to be accepted. So like we have this Real ID law here in America that's been kind of hanging out. And if it goes ever into effect, you'll go to the airport, and if you don't have an ID card that was issued according to those standards, you won't be able to board an airplane. And so you would find that like your driver's license for the first time doesn't let you get onto an airplane, which dramatically reduces its value to people who have it, because now they need to go get a passport or a passport card to board an aircraft. So really, like, from a core principles, like, how broadly is it accepted? What can it do for you at the places where it's accepted? Why I'm fascinated by identity is that identity is the trust layer for our society. There is no trust in any transaction without identity. When you think about like these transactions, there's so many different parties at play where a breakdown in trust could impact them, right? So if you have, like, take credit cards, if somebody had a stolen credit card, then it's the bank who's impacted. It's the person whose identity was stolen. It's the merchant who's also negatively impacted as well for the benefit of this, thief in this case. Same thing if you're prescribing narcotics online, which we enable about 15% of America's doctors to do every day, where if that prescription isn't issued by the doctor, then you have a pharmacy involved, you have the Drug Enforcement Administration involved, you have an opioid crisis within a community that's being fueled. And so when identity works well, which is like enabling doctors to prescribe more efficiently using the internet, I mean, amazing. But when it doesn't work well, and a thief is able to prescribe narcotics by the leader for their own monetary gain in a way that destroys communities and societies, that's the type of stuff that's really meaty and matters. And if you can make it better and more secure and accessible, you can literally change people's lives in a positive way versus a counterfactual world where such a solution would not exist.
And if we look online, I think that's one area where there is a lot of distrust right now, whether it be social media or just the web in general. So I'm curious, what impact do you think digital IDs could have on the future of the internet? So,
this is what I get fired up about, every day when I come into work, is that identity is all about access. And the way that we've delivered identity traditionally has been, very frustrating in the sense that, like, you have to reprove who you are to every website, which just isn't sustainable. But it's also been pretty inequitable in the sense that if you have credit bureaus or data brokers, that are the gatekeepers for identity, you've effectively linked affluence to access. And, prior to the pandemic, the response for government and for healthcare and for financial services was like, well, like, if you don't have credit or can't prove online, just come in person. But during the pandemic, all these government offices closed up. And so we had worked with NIST to create a video chat verification pathway way back in like 2017. And we said, listen, you have to create an online pathway for people who don't have credit history. Like, what if you live overseas? What if you are unhoused? What if you're a tribal user that's just not in one of these databases? The answer can't be that you just have to go to a government office in person, especially if you need to interact with multiple government offices. And so what we had done is, to their credit, NIST, which is the agency that sets the standards, they modified them to create a pathway. And then we created a video chat team as kind of an escape hatch or a relief valve that if you don't have credit, you can verify through this video chat session. And it's not perfect, but what it did is that before you had to go to a government office, now, as long as you can get to a Wi-Fi access point, your house, a friend's house, a coffee shop, a Target, a Starbucks, like whatever, it's now an on-ramp to government services, to financial services, to healthcare services. And once your identity is linked to that login and it's portable for the second and third and fourth identity verification at those different organizations, regardless of how you enrolled, you can prove your identity just as quickly as the most affluent person in the country. And that, to me, kind of realizing this promise of an equal internet is what we're really fired up about as a team here at IDMe. And there's a lot of structural barriers. Like, there's a lot of communities that don't have internet or hardware, but relative to the world that we found, we've made it better. And we wake up every day trying to make this digital ecosystem more inclusive, so we have less folks on the other side of this digital divide in terms of accessing services in a convenient way.
I'm conscious as well. You've got an incredibly inspiring story here. You've gone from the front line in Iraq to a hugely successful tech career. So, for any startup founders listening or wannabe startup founders at various stages of their career, can you share how you overcome any particular challenges when building your company from an idea on a whiteboard into this tech unicorn that it is today?
Yeah. If I had to pin, the roots of my success down to one thing, it's that I don't believe my own BS, and that I and that I learn, and I'm very grateful. So David Tisch, who is the first managing director of Techstars New York, he's one of our first angel investors, and I was talking to him about what we were doing, and he goes, Blake, because this all sounds like business development stuff, and you don't have product market fit yet. And he said, you need to go read Steve Blank's 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And so I went and read Steve Blank's 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And it was really amazing because it lays out like the scientific method for how to build a company at various stages, and how to like validate that there's a problem and that people are willing to pay you. And then how many of those people are, have the same problem and are willing to pay you, and how much does it cost you to acquire them, and like different phases of validating, your business model. And we went through 2 pivots, right? Like we had to pivot first away from like this Craigslist model, and we tried to be a gated garden for different types of benefits that organizations wanted to give to some of the communities, like military and students. And then the second pivot was like, folks were like, we're not really interested in your gated garden because you don't have any users, but like your ability to verify folks in real time, we would embed that onto our own website. And so that's when it was like, holy cow, like PayPal for identity. That, the same concept, but instead of credit and debit cards, that your legal identity, that you're a doctor, that you're a nurse, and that you could then take those verified credentials with you. That was like the moment. But I'd made all these promises to investors and engineers that we'd hired and everything else. But from the get-go, I said, look, like, this is what I think is true. And here's where I don't know. And our job over these next few quarters is not to like get to $100 million in 5 years. I mean, great if we do, but like we all know that spreadsheet is made up because we're not a real business yet. We want to like learn a secret in the market that nobody else knows that matters in order to innovate. And so I'll come back to you and I'll tell you what I learned. And so I'll never forget, I kind of knew that the first 2 iterations, it was the second iteration, was failing. The cohort numbers didn't look good. But we had this feedback that like, hey, PayPal for identity, that's the thing. And I went to this dinner at Andy Dunn's house. He's the founder of Bonobos, and Andy Ratcliffe, who's a Hall of Fame venture capitalist from Benchmark and started Wealthfront, was there, and the founders of Venmo were there, and the founders of Warby Parker were there. And I think it was like late 2011, early 2012. And one of the founders from Warby Parker was talking to me, and he goes, first time entrepreneur? And I said, yep. And he goes, how much money have you raised? And I go, I think it was like 4 or 5 million. And he goes, don't F it up. Big stigma. and so I had this train ride from New York City back to DC. And I was like, you know what? Like, I know how this story ends if we don't change, which is like the company slowly runs out of money. Everybody kind of parts and goes their separate way. But we've learned that there's a secret that's unmet in the market, and the public sector is talking about it, and the private sector is talking about it. And we have this unique opportunity to address it and to fix it. And I was like, you know what? If I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail there because it really matters. And if we win, we'll be one of the biggest companies on the internet that'll have made this password problem that everyone hates, go away. And again, grateful for that candid feedback with him, because it's something that still stands out this day, and grateful for my experience in combat, because the next morning I walked in and talked to the company and I was like, hey, listen, we're going to take a 90-degree pivot here because this is what we've learned and here's what we're going to do. And it takes courage. It sounds very simple now when I lay out kind of like the logical progression, but man, when you're reporting quarterly to the board and everything else, it's very, very difficult to do it. And so just be brave when it matters, learn, and don't believe your own BS. And if you do that, you're smart and you don't give up, you can build something amazing.
Fantastic advice. Absolutely love that. And looking forward to the future, where do you go from here? What's next for you? And what is it that makes you jump out of bed in the morning?
Yeah. Well, I think everything that we do saves people time and money. And so one of the flows I'm most proud of is if you've ever gotten into like Las Vegas at happy hour, it's like an hour penalty on your life as you're waiting to check in. And what we've done for one of the major hotel casinos out there is that you can now self-serve and prove your identity and get your room key within, less than a minute and be about your life. And so there's over 300,000 people every month where we give them 15 minutes of their life back, where they can, be hanging out with their friends or at the pool or, whatever it is that they came to that hotel to do. And so when I think about, this opportunity that we now have 87 million users and about 30 million of them have verified their identity to the government standards. It's really kind of like Visa to be like, well, where do these people want to be where they don't need to re-register from scratch with a new website? They don't need to create a new password. And some of these life events, like if you're on unemployment, for example, there's a pretty good likelihood that you might be on Medicaid, which is the subsidized health insurance. You might need food assistance from U.S. Department of Agriculture. And enabling folks who are in that kind of life event status to just like prove their identity once at any one of those agencies and then rapidly prove their identity to the other agencies to get all the benefits they need. Whereas in a world before us, if they didn't have credit history, they have to go in person to each one of those offices. I mean, imagine having to go to like the motor vehicle department, 3 times in a week, just brain damage. And it's unjust because it's all based on affluence. And so just making the internet more equal from pretty unequal roots is what, motivates me. And I would venture to say our entire team here at IDME to come to work in the morning and make it a little bit better every day.
And I've been in those long check-in lines in a Vegas hotel after a 10-hour flight, so I know the difference that things like that could make. And one of the questions I always like to ask at the end of my podcast is have a little bit of fun and also leave listeners on a bit of an inspirational note. Now, none of us are able to achieve success without a little help along the way. So I'm going to give you an opportunity here to say, is there a particular person or anyone that you're grateful towards who helped you get where you are today, and give them a bit of a shout out and a bit of recognition?
Well, I have to shout out my wife first, because if she listens to this, I'll be in trouble. So thank you, Suzelle. In 2011, there's a gentleman, Kelly Purdue. David Tisch introduced me to him. He was a former airborne ranger and intelligence officer and had run several venture-backed companies. And he just took me under his wing. Because look, despite Harvard Business School, it's like the difference between like learning about a combat patrol and like walking one. They're just completely different animals to like learn the theory versus to be in the trenches. And Kelly took me under his wing when I didn't know anything. And I talked to him so much. He had this app that tracked the 10 most called phone numbers. And he's like, Blake, he's like, I love you, but you just bumped my wife down to number 2. So like that was the extent of the involvement. And we hit a really, like when I had that call, this is February of 2011, I was sleeping on one of my rugby friends' couches after graduating from Harvard Business School. I think I was the only homeless Harvard Business School graduate in the world. And these poor guys, like every morning, like, Blake Hall is like sleeping on their couch in their main room when they come down. And I'm like, probably not the graduate school experience they wanted. But in February, when these companies that we wanted to get distribution from said it would take 2 or 3 years, it was just devastating emotionally when I got that feedback. And I remember calling Kelly and I said, hey, I don't think this is going to work. And he said, first, never tell that to anybody because they will not write a check for you and invest in your company. And then he said, second, chin up. We're going to find a way to make this work. And I'll always love him for that. A few weeks later, I got in my pickup truck and a U-Haul and I drove from Boston down to DC. I had $10,000 between my personal account, my business bank account, and I signed a lease on a $50,000 townhome because I had done the math that it would be cheaper to have developers, kind of Silicon Valley style, sleeping there and customer service off the table. And And thank God we raised like $500,000, like about 45 days later. But that was a real kind of burn the ships moment where, it was all in. And if Kelly hadn't given me the confidence at that particular point in my life, now we have 2,500 employees and contractors, and we're a multi-billion-dollar company, and we've meaningfully improved access rates at every organization that we support and are the market leader. But for that one relationship and that one conversation, we wouldn't be talking here this afternoon.
Wow, what a powerful moment to end on. But before I do let you go, for anybody listening, wherever they are in the world, just want to find out more information about ID.me, anything we talked about today, or even carry this conversation on by contacting your team, what's the best starting point for everything?
Sure thing. You got the website, ID.me, India Delta Mike Echo. You can find me on Twitter at Blake_Hall, and also on LinkedIn as well. If you just type Blake Hall and ID.me in the search bar, you'll find me. Neil, thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
No, thank you for coming on and sharing your story, how you came up with the idea for ID.me, the influence that your military service had on it, and also the impact that digital IDs will have on the future of the internet and so much more. But thank you so much for sharing your insights with me today.
Absolutely.
So a huge thank you to Blake for coming on and sharing how he's overcame challenges of building a company from an idea on a whiteboard into a tech unicorn. Inspirational. And also for offering a bit of advice for entrepreneurs based on his insights and his experience. And I hope that will inspire somebody listening somewhere in the world that's maybe had a similar path and got an idea that they want to pursue. So please go for it. And if there's any questions or you want to share your story on this podcast, remember, all you need to do is email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. You can send me a DM on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn at Neil C. Hughes. And my website, if you'd like to work with me, is techblogwriter.co.uk. But that's it for today's episode. So a big thank you, as always, for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.